So I thought about doing a quick video, however long this takes, around the different things that I've tried throughout the roughly 2 years so far, and the effect they had overall. Now, as you've seen in the title of this video, most likely, I'm now following an approach that has more immersion and less things like textbooks, etc. Right? So I'll also share my ideas around that, what I've noticed, and so on. So let's dive in. So I've actually made a timeline to make this a little bit easier to understand. So what we'll do is we'll actually just start right at the beginning. So at one point, I thought what I'd like to do is study a language. Now, the motivation was really not about learning the language so much as my brother was learning, or actually he'd learned Greek at that time. And he'd reached a point in Greek where a lot of people, when he was in Greece, thought he was Greek. And my sister was studying Japanese. Now, an important thing to know is that we all grew up trilingual. So our father's English, mother's French, and we grew up in Germany. So at home, we spoke French and English, and in school, outside with all our friends, we spoke German. And then at the age of 15, or when I was 15, we moved to the UK. So when my brother had learned Greek and my sister was learning Japanese, as the eldest sibling, I thought I can't have my younger brother and my younger sister speaking 4 languages and me only being able to speak 3, right? So that was really one motivation. The other motivation was because sort of health overall is a big part of my life, my career, and so on. I wanted to do some sort of brain training. So that was another motivating factor. And at that point, I decided, okay, you know what, I'm going to learn a language. I don't know what, but I'm going to learn an Asian language. And the reason for that was because from a very young age, I was always interested in culture, right? I used to go out and buy, I used to go to the Chinese shop with my mother and my father, and used to buy things like chopsticks and that kind of thing, you know, whatever you could, sweets, whatever you could buy at the age of 5 or 6, because I was doing martial arts and that kind of thing. So I was fascinated by that. So when I decided to learn a language, I then thought, okay, I could do Japanese, but my sister's doing Japanese. Korean was interesting, but not that interesting to me at the time. So the logical choice at that point was Chinese. And the main motivation was, okay, my thought process behind this is I'm going to use it for brain training. It doesn't really matter how good I get. There's no actual drive behind it beyond that. It's just, I want to do something that stimulates my brain that I can do for a prolonged period of time that potentially has benefits. So let's dive into the timeline. So it's worth noting that there was a point when I did a tiny bit of Chinese for about a week prior to this. And in fact, so even though the technical timeline starts around June, in December, previously, I did Chinese for about a week. And when I say I did Chinese, is I basically didn't do anything. I did language exchange 2 or 3 times, and I had no idea what was going on. So then I quit. And at that point, it wasn't really for brain training. It was just, okay, let me see what this is like. So in March of this year, this was 2019, I decided I wanted to learn Chinese. Now at that point, I had 0 knowledge in Chinese, and I realized there was an opportunity to get a language scholarship to Taiwan to learn Chinese. So that's what I applied for in March. Now, I got the language scholarship, and I can't remember when they informed. I think they informed me in June or July. But at that point, I decided that I was going to learn Chinese, whatever the outcome was, whether I got the scholarship or not. So I started with Pimsleur. Now, for those of you who don't know what Pimsleur is essentially an audio language learning program. It has, in my opinion, a lot of benefits and a lot of downsides. The main benefit was really that you don't focus on writing at all, right? So all I was doing for about an hour a day is shadowing, right? Shadowing and trying to figure out the language as we progressed. So I would walk into town, which would take me about 30 minutes, an hour in the morning, and I would do the lesson from the previous night, and then in the evening, I'd do the new lesson, and the 30 minutes per lesson. So overall, it was an hour per day. Now, Pimsleur has a lot of downsides. One of the main downsides is that I think it's a fairly old course. So a lot of the things they teach you are either business related or purely tourism related. So you learn all these semi-useless words, like the names of buildings in Beijing, in Shanghai, and a couple of other places, right? And the business related stuff is more on the extreme end, things like it's around trade and that kind of thing. So obviously the idea there is, you're about to go to China and you're going to need to learn some Chinese for business. So there's a lot of useless stuff like that in there. Realistically, I say useless because if you're learning, you're probably not going to use that language, those phrases again, and for you to actually remember them, they're things that you have to use on, basically on a regular basis. So I forgot a lot of things, but I also remembered quite a lot of things. Now, throughout those 3 months, roughly, so I did 3 levels out of 5 of Pimsleur. And in that time, and one of the huge advantages of that was that it was super helpful with tones. So if we go back to the December previously, when I did my exchanges, tones were basically non-existent for me, right? Pimsleur, and there's one other thing I did, is I did Paul Noble's beginner Chinese thing, which is also audio, right? Now, unfortunately, I can't remember whether I did it before Pimsleur, during, or after, but it was roughly around that same time period. The huge advantage with audio courses is that as you hear natives pronounce things, then you really zone in to the actual audio because you don't see it written down. And at that point, to be honest, I didn't even know how to write tones on paper, right? I didn't even know what pinyin was. So that was a huge advantage. So about a couple of weeks in, tones weren't an issue anymore because it was such an integral part of the actual process. Now, in that time, occasionally I tried different apps. I never got very serious with the different apps. I tried it, it overwhelmed me, kind of doing too much, right? At the beginning stages, you might have realized this for yourself in whatever language it is that you're studying, probably Chinese if you're watching this. When you do a lot of active study at the beginning, it becomes really overwhelming eventually. So you can kind of burn yourself out in a way. Now, towards the end of that time period, I decided that I was going to do HSK 1, or more importantly, I was going to go to the actual classes because it was something like £10. What is that, like $15 for 8 weeks? So I went to the place where they did it. And in the first lesson, it was basically just a history lesson, right? So there wasn't a huge amount of actual stuff that I got from that. And then the second lesson, it was me and one other lady who'd never done any Chinese. And we essentially just went through the process of learning tones. So now at this point, the teacher knew roughly what my level was, but he also knew that she was a complete beginner. So he sort of tried to find a middle ground where he would say things like, 吃饭, and then we would have to say, go, right, with the tones. Now for her, this was really challenging, obviously, because she'd never done this and she wasn't used to tones, right? If you've never heard 吃饭 in sort of the first time you hear it, you don't even realize tones are involved in the process. Now, for me, it was fairly straightforward because I just spent 2.5 months or so being entirely focused on the sound of things, right? And basically shadowing for an hour a day. After that, so after Pimsleur, I had a solid base, right? So I only went to 2 lessons of HSK and then I basically just quit. There was no point in me going. So what I did instead is I did a little bit of Isaac's book on characters, and I would do that every Saturday to the point where eventually I would do it every evening in Taiwan. So I built a bit of a base in terms of characters, right? So when I got to Taiwan, I was actually kind of able to communicate at a very basic level, in the sense that I could buy things like the train ticket from Taipei to Taichung, which is where I lived, and that kind of thing. And it was actually, this is when language learning becomes really fun, right? It's when you can start communicating with people. Now it was super basic, right? I could basically say some of the touristy things in terms of, at least I think from what I remember, it might have been wrong what I said. The guy seemed to understand what I was saying. He was very patient with me when I bought the things like the train ticket. I was quite slow, and I think he found it kind of funny. But I'd made the conscious decision that I was just going to speak Chinese in Taiwan, right? As much as humanly possible. And I didn't want to really have any foreign friends. So I had about a week or two before university school started. Should say that I actually got the scholarship, which is why I went. Now, that week was a bit unusual because I didn't know anyone. I'd go to the supermarket, I'd understand zero. The woman would ask me things like, do you want a bag? I had no idea what she was saying. But all in all, it was quite an interesting week or week and a half. Then school started. And the big advantage was that, as you can see here, I'll make this full screen again. The big advantage was really that you had the ability to find language exchanges, right? Which was really my main focus. Like I said, I didn't really want any foreign friends. I had one main friend in my time in Taiwan who was foreign. He's a German guy. And we spoke German together. And otherwise, what I did is I put down my name for the language exchange. I put down, the language or the languages that I can use to exchange with the other person. And then I got an email from a guy who's still a good friend of mine. And basically, we met up, we did language exchange, and yeah, we became good friends. And I spent a lot of time with him and my German friend. And we basically go places. I try and use as much Chinese as possible. When his GPS was on, I remember he used to say things like turn right, which I'd learned from Pimsleur, right? So I just repeated in the car. So we basically communicate in a mix of Chinese and English most of the time. And sometimes it was kind of difficult to understand what the other person was the message they were trying to get across, but it was actually a lot of fun. And obviously my German friend also had a language partner. So we also became friends with those. So we met her friend and her other friends. So when he'd meet with her in the afternoon, I'd also go, and then I'd chat with her friends, right? So we ended up creating this larger circle of basically purely Taiwanese, and I think one person from Hong Kong, but who could obviously speak Mandarin. And I'd also play basketball. And I met another guy there who became a friend of mine, who's also from Hong Kong, but he obviously spoke Mandarin. So basically our entire social circle, or at least my entire social circle, was Mandarin speaking, bar the Chinese friend of mine, the German friend of mine. And that was really, really great 3 months. I think I made a lot of progress in that time. And in terms of what the lessons were like, if you're interested in that, we did 3 hours a day, I believe, Monday to Friday. And then we could pick 2 basically bonus lessons. And the ones I picked were pronunciation, and I believe it was speaking, something around those lines. So the pronunciation class was really, we'd go into the class with this older lady. I think she was 73 or so. And she was amazing. Right? She was amazing in terms of getting people to say things the right way. She basically didn't speak any English. And all the classes we had in every lesson, were practically free of English or any other language. It was basically just Mandarin. I also had a speaking class, obviously, but I think honestly, probably the 2 most beneficial classes were the main class and the pronunciation class. And the pronunciation class was everything from her saying things and us having to say the tones, to tests where she would say longer sentences and we had to write down the tones over the pinyin and that kind of thing. But that's really what it was for. It's really for tones, that lesson. And so it was essentially 3 hours every day and maybe 4 hours 2 days a week, right? I can't remember what the total is, something like 18 hours a week. And then we basically had the entire afternoon off, right? From 11 to the next day we had off. So in that, we'd spend that time with obviously other people and with the friends I mentioned earlier. So that was a really beneficial 3 months. Now, when things got more difficult, I'll show you the timeline again. Things got more difficult when I left Taiwan, which was on the 2nd of December. And so I had a time frame. So we'd sort of made the decision that we would continue to do language exchange, but online. Now, one of the challenges was really time difference, obviously. But my main teacher that I had when I was in Taiwan, in our final sort of, I suppose it was speaking test, basically asked me if I wanted to do language exchange. I said, sure, it was great for me to actually have a teacher as a language exchange partner. So we decided essentially that we'd start language exchange in January, which we did. So she had to pass an English exam to do her master's in the UK. And I obviously wanted to use it to continue my Chinese. So about twice a week, at the beginning it was about twice a week, we would continue with a textbook. It sort of reduced more and more over time. So by the time we got to around March, the end of March, we maybe did one a week, and then we'd do one every 2 weeks, because she was preparing to go to the UK. She'd passed her exam. Now, one of the big things that I did in that time frame at the beginning was I turned on a Taiwanese radio station from Taipei. And every morning when I got up, I'd listen to it for the first 1 to 3 hours, because I work from home, right? That's one of the big advantages. And I understood zero, pretty much. But one thing that happened over the time frame was that I managed to, I suppose, pass in my head eventually different words, where one word started, where it ended. Basically my recognition of sentences, even though the understanding didn't really improve because I didn't know what they were saying that much, I'd understand the odd word, right? It went from understanding nothing to understanding the odd word, words that I already knew, to being able to exactly separate where words started and ended, etc. Right? That's really the big change that happened over that time frame. Now, if we go back to the timeline, when my exchange ended with that teacher, I basically totally stopped Chinese. So in that time, I did Chinese maybe 2 hours a week, and I would read occasionally in the evening. I'd use the graded readers on Pimsleur and that kind of thing. Now, from about April to August, I practically didn't know Chinese. So I had a time frame for about 3 to 4 months where I did almost nothing, right? And I can't remember exactly what the reason was, probably because I didn't have a structure anymore. I didn't really know how to go about it. I had bought the next textbook, which I'd started with my teacher, which is the one that my friends that stayed in Taiwan were working on. And then in August, I decided, you know what, I've got to get my act together and continue doing something. So I then went on italki, and I trialed a couple of different teachers. For those of you who don't know what italki is, I'm assuming most of you do, but for those who don't, it's essentially a platform where you can find teachers in your target language. Right now, they're not all qualified teachers. Some of them are what are called community tutors, and they're just native speakers in that particular language. So I tried different ones. I tried everything, because you get 3 trial lessons. I tried everything from actual teachers that charge more to community tutors. But my aim was really just to chat, right? To have conversations. I didn't particularly want structured lessons per se, right? So I found a teacher, and I went full, well, actually, you can't really call it full balls to the wall, but I booked about 2 to 3 lessons a week. And the plan was that we'd do the following, right? At least my plan was we would chat and I would write down all the words I don't know. And then I would essentially learn all the words I don't know. And then we'd continue doing this. Now, at the beginning, my lists were gigantic, right? They were, I can't exactly remember what the communication was like. But I remember having really, I might be able to find it, really long lists of like 20, 30 plus words, right? Of everything from cancer to God knows what, right? Anything that was related to my life, her life, whatever, right? Except some were really complicated. Some were really complicated words that wouldn't come up again. Now, initially I had this whole motivation of writing them down and then looking over them again before the next lesson and so on, right? I wasn't using flashcards. And I was also started reading again on Pleco. Now on Pleco, you can make flashcards, which is what I was doing. So I'd take words and I'd make individual word flashcards. Now the problem that I came across in that time was that I started implementing words from flashcards that meant the same thing in English, but were wrong in that context. So for those of you, I don't know how far along you're in Chinese, but the word to understand, right, in Chinese is about 4, 5 different ones, right? 懂，明白，了解，理解. So you've got quite a few different ones, right? And they all have a slightly different meaning. So that's one example, right? So what I'd do is I'd plug one of those into the sentence, but then she would go, it's not quite correct, right? You should use X instead. So that was really one of the big things I noticed. I realized, okay, if I use word flashcards, yes, I can remember a lot of words, but I'm using the wrong words in the wrong context. And the other thing I was doing is in my head, I was going from English to Chinese, right? So because we were talking about like, honestly, things that were probably above what I should have been speaking about at that point. Everything from the environment to, like I said, so my father's had cancer, so we were speaking about that, to a whole bunch of different things, right? Words that honestly, and sentence structures that I couldn't really create. So I would go through the whole pattern in my head in English, and then I would try and switch it to Chinese. Now, over that time, it's really hard to say how much I improved. What did improve is my listening, that's for sure. Obviously, when you're speaking to someone one-on-one. I did find that the way I spoke probably shifted more from the way people speak in Taiwan in terms of pronunciation to closer to hers, which is more, she's from Xingdao. So it's sort of more Northern Chinese, right? And I personally, I didn't really realize it that much. Now, one of the other things I did is I used Glossica. So I was experimenting with a whole bunch of different tools. Now, I don't think I put Glossica on the actual timeline. So at this point, we're here, right? We're in the actual learning, in the italki chat process. So I didn't do anything else but italki, and I used, in January in 2021, I used Glossica. Now, Glossica is really, for those of you who don't know, you hear the sentence in English, pause, it'll tell you the sentence in Chinese at full normal pace, right? You can do a Taiwan version, you can do a Chinese version, as in a China version, right? In terms of accent, pronunciation, etc. And the words that they use sometimes are a little bit different. So I believe initially I used the Taiwan one, then I switched to the China one because this is more built around what people say on a daily basis, right? And in Taiwan, people use yo and hui in a sentence where it's technically not grammatically correct. If you were in an exam and you were writing yo in that sentence, or hui in that sentence, they'd have to mark it as wrong. But it's how a lot of people speak, both in Taiwan and obviously, and in mainland China in general, obviously Hong Kong is Cantonese, right? So I sort of thought, you know what, I don't know, because the plan was at that point, my motivation was, okay, I'm now going to do this, and my aim is to pass TOEFL, right? Is to do the TOEFL exam, which is the HSK is the Chinese proficiency exam in China. TOEFL is the Chinese proficiency exam in Taiwan. So the aim was to do the TOEFL exam. So I thought, you know what, if I start really focusing on this, and I whenever I want to say something, that's the first sentence that comes to mind, the one that I've learned, and I write that in the exam, they'll have to mark it as wrong, and it's not great. So I switched to the China one, right, which is a more standard Chinese one, and it's grammatically more correct. So because it involves shadowing, right, essentially, you hear it in English, then you hear it in Chinese, and you're basically just repeating it after them. You're essentially shadowing, right? So my pronunciation shifted more in that direction. Now on the actual timeline, and that was quite useful. Now, in that time frame, that was essentially what I did. And I used Glossika for maybe a month, and then I stopped because sentences were becoming too complicated. And it builds up the current version, right? There's a version you can find, which is the old version, where you can essentially choose how much you do per day. In the online version, I chose something like 10 new sentences a day, right? And the actual, because it's done on an SRS system, as in spaced repetition system, eventually kind of became too much for what I was doing, the reading, my flashcards I had in the reading as in the individual words ones. But it definitely built up more, right? The speed of being able to say particular sentences definitely improved in that time. And then I stopped. And I continued with my italki lessons, but they kind of reduced again from something like 3 a week to 1 or 2 a week towards the end. And then I stopped again, right? I stopped in April. And again, I did nothing for probably about 1.5, 2 months. And we're getting closer to now. So after that, I started exchanges because someone who's also a teacher in the school I went to in Taiwan wanted to improve their English because they were planning to potentially go to Canada. So every Saturday I did a language exchange with him, and we spoke for maybe 3 hours. So we do 1.5 hours-ish of Chinese and then 1.5 hours-ish of English. And then in the week I would book, again, I would book lessons, right? So I do maybe 1 a week. And I then found language exchange partners on Tandem. And I had the huge luck or advantage that one of the language exchanges that I got was someone who is a teacher at what's probably one of the best language centers in Taiwan, except that she was in Germany. So she wanted to learn German, and obviously I was doing Chinese. So we did a German-Chinese exchange. And that was hugely beneficial because instead of it sort of divulging into becoming a conversation where we would just drift between English and Chinese, she would consciously force me to we didn't use any English. If I didn't know how to say a thing, I had to try and explain it. So she was really, really good at that. Now, at that point, I didn't know she was a teacher, and I thought, wow, these exchanges are really good. And I sort of carried that over into my talkie lessons, where if I didn't know a thing, I'd try and explain it. I tried to basically remove any semblance of another language from our communication. Eventually, I found out she was a teacher, and everything made sense. But then I came across some videos online from everything from immersion to Refold. Now, I'd followed some of the Refold stuff before, but I'd never actively pursued it, right? So at that point, we kind of get here. Now, I then came across a video where someone, unfortunately, I can't remember his name. What I'll do is I'll put the link in the description, who passed the highest Japanese exam in 18 months, which was super motivational, right? And he'd made this entire sheet for Japanese, which we'll go through in a second. And he'd obviously made it public. So I copied it and I made a version for myself in Chinese. So at that point, I'll share my screen so you can see. Now you can set your goals, right? You can set your starting point. So I started on the 16th of the 8th and I set it for 365 days, right? So 1 year. And the aim was to do 2 hours of immersion a day and 50, initially I had 1 hour of Anki per day. Now here's basically what happened. So this is fairly recently, right? Because I'm about 2.5 months in. Now in the first couple of days I went to a wedding and I basically did very little reading, except for, I'm not really sure what happened here, obviously did more. But it was more focused on watching TV, right? Watching TV, listening to stuff, etc. In terms of the Anki decks, I'm using 3 different decks, right? I'm using one deck, which is, again, the Heisig one. I started again. I'm using a self-made deck, and I'm using spoon-fed Chinese. And technically, spoon-fed Chinese goes against the whole Refold methodology, but I'll explain why I'm using it. For me personally, I'm actually kind of, maybe it's probably not the case for everyone, I kind of disagree with the idea of not speaking for a long period of time. The reason being that here's one thing that was really important to me. And this is a key takeaway for me over this journey, is I want, before I say something, I'm trying to say something, to have the person's voice in my head in the native pronunciation and not my own voice. So what I mean is this: if I want to say, can you pass me a glass of water? I don't want to hear my Chinese voice saying it in my head before I say it. I want to hear a native saying, can you get me a glass of water in Chinese? And then I'm going to try and say it the same way that I hear it in my head. Right? Hopefully that makes sense. So the unfortunate thing with, I think, speaking too early and reading, this is one of my issues why I didn't want to read too much, is when you read, you're obviously sub-vocalizing, I think is the right term, what you're reading. In other words, you hear your own voice in your head while you're reading. And personally, I'm not a huge fan, because I think when you go through that process, this is purely theory, you further create mistakes that you're already making in terms of your pronunciation. So from the beginning, from the very first day that I started learning Chinese to now, I've always had an obsession with pronunciation and copying people as much as possible. I don't want to say things the way that I think they should be said. I want to say things the way that someone says it. So I want to copy them as much as humanly possible. And that is one of the things that I don't like about reading. Now that improves over time. Obviously, the more you know, the easier it becomes, and I understand that. Now, this is also why I'm not spending a lot of time reading. Because I found that one thing that happens is when you're learning a new word, if you spend a lot of time reading, and again, this is just my experience, right? If I spend a lot of time reading, and when I learn a new word, I then picture it written in my head, which I don't want, right? I want to have the word. Here's an example. I have sentences and words ingrained in my brain that I've never seen written down, or at least until recently, I'd never seen written down, right? The word for gym in Chinese, the only reason I know it is because I was told it by friends in Taiwan who said, we're going to the gym, I'm going to the gym, da, 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 right? So that sentence, I don't even know how to begin to write gym in Chinese, right? Now I do, but there was a point when I didn't. But I knew exactly how to say it. I knew exactly what the tones were because it was ingrained from someone else saying it to me. Now, if someone said it to me once, for example, on italki, then if I read a lot, then I'd want to have them write it out so that I could see it, so I could see the pronunciation, I could learn it with the correct pronunciation, right? And I do this because, again, the way people emphasize certain bits, depending on where they're from, is different, right? So you can look up the pinyin for week, and it'll be different if you look it up in Taiwanese pronunciation versus the way people say it in mainland China, for example. In Taiwan, it ends in a second tone. In mainland China, it ends in a first, right? So, and there's a whole bunch of examples like that. Now, so that's why I didn't spend so much time reading. But one of the big things I did is I'd watch things, right? So I'd watch films, movies for American friends, and I'd listen to podcasts. And so that's really the big, in terms of what went into listening. So this is listening, this is Anki, and this is reading, right? And this is sentences added in terms of flashcards. So at this point, obviously, the lesson I'd learned is I don't want to do individual words because then I don't know what to plug in, what belongs in the right place. So I was adding sentences. Now, listening was podcasts, watching things, basically any immersion besides reading. Reading obviously is here, and then Anki was here. And then the aim was to do 20 sentences a day. So I'd carry this on for a while, right? Some days I didn't manage to get. Now, it's worth noting that I do very little passive immersion. Basically, all the immersion I do is active immersion. In other words, I'm consciously paying attention and trying to understand. I'm not a huge fan. I feel like it's cheating if I put passive immersion in here, so I don't count it. For lessons, things like italki, I use half the time as immersion, right? So if I've done an hour-long conversation, I put 30 minutes of immersion in here in terms of listening. That's basically how I'm currently calculating things. And I reduced my lessons, right? I decided I'm just going to do either no or one lesson a week, maybe the occasional exchange, while I go through this process. So that, again, the theory is I want to hear the person's voice, the native voice in my head for the entire sentence, not create it myself. You can let me know your thoughts are on that if you've had a similar experience or not. So I didn't do particularly much reading, and I spent more time listening, and I added 10 sentences from things that I was watching, or things that, for example, in a lesson, if there's a sentence with a new word, I get the person to we'd write out the sentence together and make that into a card. Now, most of my cards are audio cards. Again, you understand why I'm doing this, but I use very few written cards. Everything is audio. So on the front, I only hear the audio, and then I have to basically understand it. So I do 10 of those, and then I 10 spoon-fed Chinese, which is a deck that has Chinese, English sentences, and English, Chinese sentences, again, the same one. Personally, I think spoon-fed Chinese is hugely beneficial because you're not technically learning grammar. What I mean is you get strange sentences like do as he says, right, in English. If you try to guess what that is in Chinese in your sort of beginning stage, you wouldn't be able to guess it, right? It's completely different from English. But then when you hear do as he says, and then you see it, and then you hear it in Chinese, and then obviously you get the other card, you get the reverse where it's do as he says in Chinese, it also has the written version, and then you can see it in English on the reverse of the card. I find it super beneficial for me personally. So I have both. I have 10 spoon-fed Chinese, and I have 10 cards that I make myself, and then I do 10 characters per day. Again, writing isn't particularly a goal of mine at this point, so I'm taking the writing part slow. I know it'll take me a while to get to 3,000 characters, but that's fine. I have enough to read, and I learn more with things like for Chinese and the flashcards that I make myself, etc. Right. So one of the big changes over this time frame was that I got to a point where I was using Chinese subtitles because my reading isn't that great. It's good enough to read things like graded readers, etc. But when you're watching something like a slice of life drama series, there are plenty of words that I don't know how to write. So eventually I thought, you know what, screw this. I'm going to get rid of subtitles completely. So I got rid of all subtitles and I just did watching and listening, and that's it. Now, over those 2.5 months, I actually think that at the stage where I'm at, I don't know particularly what Refold stage it's in. My Chinese is good enough to have a conversation with someone on italki, right? About a variety of different things. It's by no means great, but at least I can communicate what I want. They understand what I'm trying to say, and I understand what they're saying. And then when there's an unknown word, they explain the word to me, usually in Chinese. So that's basically what my level of Chinese is at. Now, I had a pretty big breakthrough for me personally, in that there were new words that I figure out by watching things just by hearing, and I know how to say them purely because I've heard them, but I've never seen them written down. An example from about 2 days ago is playing the violin, right? I can't remember how it came up or what episode of what. Basically, someone was playing the violin, and playing the violin was part of the conversation. I figured out what playing the violin is by watching it, and then I had to check it to make sure that it actually meant playing the violin. But I know how to say it because I listened to it, right? Now, because I listened to it, I know the way they say it versus how it's written. This goes back to my theory from earlier, where I think it's actually beneficial to be able to hear the way that someone native says it in your own head before you try and say it yourself, which is easy to do with things like Pimsleur or Paul Noble, because you just hear them saying, you're essentially shadowing, right? So that's really the big takeaway. Now, one of the other things I've changed recently is, if I share my screen again, is I reduced my actual Anki goal. So it used to be 1 hour. I reduced it to 50 minutes because I'd get through all my decks in less than an hour. And at which point, because it gives you stats, this thing, right, tells you how many days you've missed, how many days you're on point, how much you're over by, how much you're under by, that kind of thing, as well as a snapshot over time, right? 30 days. In the first 30 days, I spent 35 hours on Anki. I did total immersion of 69 hours, right? Less in the second month. This is the third month, right? This is currently what I'm on. So I don't know exactly how many weeks I'm in, maybe 1.5, 2 weeks into the third month. So I was really going to just reduce my stats if I kept it at an hour, because it doesn't take me an hour to do all my flashcards. So I brought that down, and that's really it. So I've started reading more, the graded readers, specifically on Plecker, because it has a whole bunch, and you can buy them immediately. You don't have to wait for delivery. You can check words immediately on the actual app. And I do italki lessons once a week, potentially twice a week, where we chat, right? But one of the big changes, I think, has been that English doesn't exist in my head anymore, which has been super interesting. So when I'm speaking to someone in Chinese, I don't, even if it's a complicated sentence, it doesn't come up in English, and then I translate it, my mind just goes blank. And then if we switch to English, for example, let's say my language teacher, their community tutors, I don't use proper teachers on italki, doesn't know what the word is that I'm trying to explain, or she wants to know what it is in English, then I will tell her in English. But when I switch over to English in my head, I find it really hard to think of the word, even if it's something super simple, which is actually what I'm aiming for, because in both German, English, and French, if this is an issue I've had a lot, is if there's a sentence, right, I understand perfectly in French or in German, and then I have to translate it into one of the other languages, English, whatever, English, French, German. I really struggle to do it. It's like the three languages aren't connected in my head, right? But Chinese has always been connected to English. In other words, that's why it was easy to have the sentence appear in my head in English and then try and translate it into Chinese and sort of use weird, right? Maybe use weird sentence structures that weren't totally right or just sounded bizarre. With the amount of immersion that I'm doing and the flashcards that I'm using, that doesn't happen. It's like they're separating more and more and more over time, where it becomes more and more challenging to translate from Chinese to English and vice versa, almost. In other words, actually translating from English to Chinese is probably easier than the other way around. In other words, if I try and switch over to English, I basically have to change my mindset completely to be able to say what I'm attempting to say. And then I have to completely change the way I think and my mind when I go back to Chinese. It's a really weird experience, but I'm familiar with it because of the other ones, right? But that, for me, that was a major breakthrough, because that's essentially what I was looking for, right? I was looking for something that would separate me, that would separate my Chinese from the English. So that's really one of the big takeaways from just listening to stuff and doing the flashcards that I do. Even if it's an entire English sentence, an entire Chinese sentence, I don't have to understand the structure of the Chinese sentence fully, but it just pops up when I speak, right, automatically, which is one of the big advantages I found from spoon-fed Chinese. So that's really it. I'm probably going to do another video like this every month or every 2 months. One of the things I did is, at the beginning of this process of the immersion, I recorded a 2-minute video of me talking in Chinese to myself about now, what I was doing, etc. And the aim is to do one every 2 to 3 months, probably every 3 months, and eventually compare them. So at some point, you'll get a breakdown of what's happened over the course of 6 months or so. What it was like at the beginning, after 3 months, 6 months, etc. It's a way for me to track my progress, right? Because it's kind of difficult to see your progress over time, because the gradual increase, the gradual process, you don't really, improvement, you don't really notice when you're doing something every day, right? It's new words appear, you know how to say things, da 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 da. If I can't think back to what it was like 2 months ago and say that I've improved, but I obviously have, right? This is what I mean. So this is why I'm doing the videos. But that's really it. So I'll do another one of these about what's happened over the past couple of months, in a month or 2 or 3. And yeah, that's it. I hope you enjoyed.